are dying.
Retrofitting islands. Prime source heat pumps.
Because I don't have a future.
Hello, it's the 20th of June 2023 and it's Thursday and it's time for the Climate Week from us, Climate Debate UK. In the back room is Ed Rennie, who's going to join us in a bit. We're going to be talking about the news. Also joining us is Dan Salt, who you may have seen around on Twitter and Substack, getting increasingly vexed like the rest of us about lights that fall off screens and things like that, and also governments that fail to meet our basic needs. So let's start with the news then. If I can find the news. And here it is. There we go. Right. Okay. The most last week or so has been, the news has been dominated by stories that we are suffering from. Well, Europe is suffering from some extraordinary kind of heat wave, the likes of which no one has ever seen before. We've been hearing about temperatures in Greece reaching into the upper 40s. Upper the centigrade, that is, of course, and this is being presented by media across the board as extremely unusual. But the internet's climate sleuths have been investigating these claims, and it turns out that there is nothing particularly unusual about them at all, and that that the countries experiencing these things were experiencing the same temperatures 40 or 50 years ago. And that's even if we're sure that the temperatures have been achieved. So in the previous slide, we saw I think a Guardian or Observer article concerned about 48 temperatures of 48 degrees. But then when we look at what was actually achieved in Athens on at that time, it turns out things were much cooler, in the order of 10 degrees colder. Similarly, the BBC have been reporting temperatures of 46 degrees centigrade in Sardinia and 47 degrees in Sicily. But when the records are actually made public, we see in the order of 9 to 11 degrees centigrade cooler temperatures. And what seems to be suggesting, what some people seem to be suggesting, is that these temperatures are something new. Well, the skeptics are arguing that what the commentators, the more alarmist commentators, are suggesting is that they are measuring ground temperatures. If I can find the slide here, these aren't air temperatures. Typically, weather data has recorded the temperature of the air at 2 meters above the surface. But now what seems to be happening is that people are taking the temperature from the floor. And if you've ever spent any time in a sort of a countryside setting after a hot day, so you're going to be further away from the urban heat island effect, you will often feel on the tarmac on roads in the countryside, you'll feel it radiating upwards. And this is because the ground obviously absorbs far more heat than the air is capable of controlling. So you can get very high temperatures from from the ground heating up. But some alarmist commentators, people should know better, seem to be making the most out of this these heat waves and this phenomenon, to claim that these are dangerous and terrifying and unprecedented temperatures, when there's absolutely, or appears to be, no basis for these claims at all. Vulnerable people will die, say such people. Another story that's been coincident with these claims is that that last summer saw 62,000 people die from record-breaking heat in Europe, and this is picked up by The Guardian, and this is where we really see journalists and newspapers and news organizations completely failing to get to grips with the skepticism and the curiosity that's needed really badly in these kind of matters. This study, for example, it comes at the end of the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, and yet talks about excess deaths. So we'll have a look at the numbers in a second. But what's very interesting is a quote in The Guardian is sort of seemingly dismissing what we observed through the COVID pandemic in terms of the daily reporting of excess deaths. So a lot of people pointing out during that time that the people who were dying were predominantly in their 80s and with one or two or more comorbidities. So these are people who were probably going to die anyway, and they were made to die a few weeks or so earlier by the virus. And the same is true of heat waves. That has a very similar effect in terms of the statistics. And this Guardian quote seems to take issue with that, and it seems to say there are people that would have died anyway, but those are not counted with this methodology. So this is a disingenuous claim. They're not counted, but they are included. Those are the people that are dying. So it does seem to be that the researchers and the journalists involved in this know what they're doing and telling, quite frankly, porky pies to the public. And here is that study. It's published in Nature Medicine journal, a very prestigious journal, and you won't find in any mention in this of any COVID or post-COVID effects that we might want to look at before we start making claims about excess mortality during certain seasons. We might want to ask whether there were some health effects left over from people being neglected during lockdowns, or economic effects. We know that there's a very strong relationship between household income and longevity and health in general. So we would expect a paper making such seemingly dramatic claims to have investigated those things, but that was not the case. And so we see here the methodology at work. This is how the paper has guesstimated a heat-related mortality, and by looking for excess deaths compared to a baseline. Here's a more frank admission from the same paper, which is temperature-related risk, and we see, as everyone knows, and has been pointed out many times by many people on this subject, it turns out that cold weather is far more risky than warm weather. It lasts for longer and it claims more lives. I think the difference is a factor of 10, but it's only hot weather that really interests the journals, the scientists and researchers, and the likes of The Guardian. But that's an aside. So this is so this is the sort of thing I'm trying to say needs to be seen as the context of this report. Excess mortality. We know excess mortality has been rising in the post-COVID era, and we can show that the purple and the red lines in this chart of the deaths per week of the year in EU 27 countries. There's a massive difference that in recent years compared to previous years. So this is a phenomenon of the post-COVID era, and it seems to me quite disingenuous of researchers to try to pin this on climate change or and as if you remember that the figure is 61,000 deaths caused over the course of the entire summer, that would only just about register on this screen, on this graph. There are in the at a minimum 80,000 deaths in the EU 27 countries per week, and so an estimate of 61,000 deaths over the course of the entire summer sounds quite dramatic, but in context, it turns out to be less interesting. So moving on, in the news in the UK has been, it seems that hydrogen has been abandoned in favor of heat pumps. It seems that hydrogen is a non-starter. We discussed that last week. And so now we're going, rather than having hydrogen gas boilers, Grant Shapps has decided that we will all have heat pumps. This is coincident with the GWPF putting out a pretty decent analysis of heat pumps, which probably makes them look no better than hydrogen, in fact. So it looks like all the problems are being put into one technology now, rather than two, which in some senses is at least easy to deal with. But now we've got to focus our criticisms of this policy and get some action on it. Great British Nuclear was announced this week. Again, it was supposed to be announced last week, but it was delayed, probably until there was a heat wave or something. But the small print is that we're going to have to pay £20 billion to get our small nuclear power stations. So it looks like it's going to be a lot of subsidies that we're going to have to find again. Similarly, although we've got a great British gigafactory to look forward to in the southwest, that's going to be companies spending £4 billion, we're going to have to find the subsidies for it. Speaking of subsidies, they are no longer enough for Vattenfall, who have pulled out of a offshore wind farm project as costs surge 40%. And the Net Zero Watch rightly saying, told you so, because they have been telling us so for a very long time. Finally, on British news, it looks like we're going to have ULEZ rules before we can have new housing developments. It looks like a case of agencies seeking greater and greater power for themselves. Briefly, before I bring Ed in, there has been a climate summit with the US and China, hoping to restart climate talks as far as the green great and good were concerned. But those hopes were pretty quickly dashed when the US refused climate reparations, and then and that's something we've been pointing out in the last few episodes, is consistent with Rishi Sunak pulling out pulling the UK out of an £11 billion pledge. And then, of course, China just says, no, we're going to have our own net zero agenda. And it's very easy to see why. Why would you, if you were China, enjoying all this growth, enjoying all this industrialization, enjoying all the benefits of the West closing down in its industry, why would you join with the US in this economic and industrial suicide, or perhaps more the European economic and industrial suicide? It's not going to happen, is it? Right, let's bring Ed in. Hi, Ed. How you doing?
Hello. Good evening.
So, what do you make of all that? We better be quick because I went on a bit too long about the scare story, the 61,000.
Well, just briefly on that. I mean, I think your points about it is now suspected, and Matt Ridley and Patrick O'Flynn have, amongst others, have said, look, if this is true, that they've switched from air temperatures to land temperatures to create this increase in temperature, this admittedly moderate increase from the worst heat waves of previous years and decades, then that is a scandal. And we don't know yet. We don't know if they've done that yet. One suspects that they have, but we'll have to see. And that's important. It wouldn't come as a surprise if they had. The other two stories I'd pick up on would be come second to the John Kerry one. The other one is the nuclear one, because I think that's really important. And I think any long-term energy thinking from the government is going to have to involve subsidies. I would love to think that the private sector alone could come up with, the energy provision that we need. And certainly you would get a lot more of that if you had a genuine market and you pulled out, let's say you pulled out all the subsidies, but it was a matter of government backing, planning permission, and so forth. Then you suspect actually it would work in favor of where I think it should go. Secondly, the second point on this is that if we were in a climate emergency, we would have gone to nuclear 5 years ago, 10 years ago. When Nick Clegg and David Cameron were in government, if all the evidence suggested a climate emergency and that we're in a climate crisis, whichever term you want to use, they would have said, we've got to go nuclear and we've got to go big, and other countries would have done so as well. So France, as we know, went to 80% nuclear, which it's now starting to lose. But they saw that if you built one nuclear power station, which is what we have stupidly done, it's very expensive. But if you build a large number, then economies of scale mean it's much more affordable, hence the subsidies. But really the point is if for any Joe blogs out there, for anyone who thinks normally about politics and economics, if we were in a climate emergency, then some Western countries would be moving very quickly to nuclear. And it may be that I haven't checked on it this week, but it may be that for example, Norway is doing that despite their very strong oil and gas resources. So that's the thing, and that's where we need to go. If net zero was approached in a pragmatic and sensible way, you would say what we'll do is, for now, we'll invest particularly in gas, domestic gas. We'll properly research shale gas in this country. We'll use our hydrocarbon resources domestically, and we'll partner as a little bit we are doing with Norway and America, but we would build up our nuclear very quickly. And that way we'd be able to get to net zero by 2050. Now, they're not doing that. And they're not doing that because there isn't really a climate emergency. There is this strange political groupthink where you've got to kind of self-flagellate. You've got to demonstrate your virtue. And it's connected to lots of other things. And it's very difficult to demonstrate because people strangely are still quite trusting of their political and scientific institutions, even though they've been lied to and misled by them on several occasions in recent political history. they kind of tend to ask the reasonable question, well, why would they lie? Why would they say all this?
Should we
And
see an
that's something we have
example
to
of?
combat.
Should we see an example of people going kind of crazy? I know this is what you're talking about, but
Well, I was checking Ed Miliband's Twitter feed, as I wish I
let's
never
have a
had
look
to
at
do, but, yeah.
Justin. Is this Justin Rowlett? Let's have a quick look at like kind of what might be underneath it.
Can we hear him? I don't think we can hear him.
Oh, okay. Can you hear him now?
Yeah.
Did you hear him, or was it?
No, but thankfully we have the subtitles, and also I remember, funnily enough, I actually caught this live, or at least it's one of the things they repeat broadcast on the BBC News. So I got it.
Right. Well,
the key, obviously, the key thing is that this last bit of red line at the end, you know.
Well, I think the key thing is that there's this presupposition that this era, the flat era of climate of temperatures, is supposed to be when we sort of we became the human race and developed agriculture and then thrived, and now we're unsettling that, when in fact, can you hear me? I see people in the comments saying can't hear anything. Can you hear me, or can you just not hear the clip?
Hold on.
Okay, well, I'll wait for people to comment. But so the myth is not. People are getting rightly pointing out that like the part there weren't sort of sufficiently sensitive thermometers 800,000 years ago to make these claims, but the current period, you see this very, very quick rise up, which is of that order, which is a much more rapid rise than could have been detected in the past. Moreover, that's when we all started living. That's when we all started having lives worth living. That means children weren't dying. People were living to their 80s and 90s. People had cars and washing machines. Their lives weren't characterized by drudgery. So sod the thermometer. What was our quality of life? That's the thing that this kind of this BBC alarmism misses the point of.
No, and this is the point I'm keep making, is that it's typifying of a groupthink. It's an ideological groupthink which believes in its own virtue, and therefore is willing to lie to itself and willing to play with statistics to create that drama. I mean, that kind of that concertinaing, that squishing of that red line into a tiny section of the graph is just absurd, because he's squished there the entire history of the world, of the Industrial Revolution, into what looks like, it looks like a few months on the graph. It's absurd. It's just a nonsense, and it's all just to close down the debate. It's to close down the debate. Look at these maps of Spain. Look at this graph. The discussion's over. Anyone who's questioning this in any way, either in terms of policy or in terms of anything relating to the science, is a denialist or a tinfoil hatter or everything. It's to close down the discussion, and ultimately it's about control for them. They want to be in the ascendancy. They want to be in control.
Yeah, and it's kind of religious, isn't it? And this religion has this bizarre idea. Here's the clip. Here's an FT article by Camilla Cavendish. There is something awesome about the march of geological time and the chilling indifference of nature to our plight. Each of the 5 mass extinctions that have occurred have created new ecological niches for other species. Mammals expanded after the dinosaurs' demise, and humans evolved as a result. If we don't want to be replaced, we should want our governments to do whatever it takes to deflect the climate asteroid.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's that last sentence is just is what it comes down to. You've got otherwise intelligent, sensible people in the Financial Times and other publications and all over the broadcast media saying this, and they're basically saying, forget democracy, because people's economic needs and the masses are too thick. They don't understand. What they need to do is accept that the governing class needs to move because there's an emergency, and whatever it takes. Except whatever it takes doesn't include moving to nuclear power as 80% of our resources. No one is saying that wind and solar shouldn't be there on the sidelines, and if the technology improves in terms of both the actual function of the solar panels and the wind turbines and the battery storage, so those 3 things, they should be kept, as a technological point of inference, just as we're always investing in nuclear fusion, in the sense of making it not as dangerous and as polluting as it is now. You always should be pushing at these new technologies to create something new. And if they do, then as we saw to some extent with hybrid cars, but always people are talking about mobile phones and everything. If a technology comes up that's more environmentally friendly and more neutral to the climate and the environment, people will go for it. They don't need to be controlled.
I think you're being too nice to her. She's just a lunatic. And the ideology is there, but look. Speaking, the point
is that's typical lunacy. It's kind of mainstream lunacy.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah. We need to unpack the ideology for sure. Well, we're going to talk about Just Stop Oil, who invaded the BBC. The BBC's opening of the first night of the proms. Yeah, opening of the proms. So I'm worried we're not going to be able to hear this, but should we try? Can you tell me if you can hear it? Well, it can't play it anyway. Never mind. Everyone detests Just Stop Oil, it seems, at the moment. We'll go on to discuss that. But do you want to bring our guest in, Ed, and introduce?
Yeah. So just to say, I'm Dan Salt. I first encountered you on Twitter some years ago, and you did this great Twitter thread on Remain versus Leave, and it came up in my timeline, and I said to you, you should put this in a blog. And ever since then, you've had a fantastic blog, and you've built up your reputation on Twitter. And I think most people who've got to know you know that you're one of these fantastic people who's somewhat self-educated and, a bit of a financial guru, a bit of economist, but obviously people love your political takes as well, which are very present on your blog. So no, we're very happy to have you on the show. And I'm sure you've got something to say about not just Stop Oil, but John Kerry thinking he can rebuild the relationship with China and that they'll cooperate on renewables and climate. But yeah, so welcome on board, and we're happy to hear from you.
Great pleasure to be here, and I'm sure I will have an opinion on everything. It's what I'm known for.
Yes. So what do you make of I think in particular the story about, Ben's presenting us with the Just Stop Oil. I mean, what's been your take on them? I mean, obviously this is the latest nonsense with the proms, but they
Look,
did
I mean,
Wimbledon, they did the snooker. You know, what's your sense on them?
Yeah, look, I'm a Democrat. If you want to go out and protest, that is obviously your right. That doesn't mean that you should be stopping other people getting on with their lives. It certainly doesn't mean you should be stopping ambulances getting to hospitals, particularly. And I know it's a probably slightly overdone, but I don't think probably not far off. I'll bet you any money most of them are middle class, comfortably well off, and don't have to worry about the consequences of not going to work on an average day. If you're a working class person, if you're a working person, you're trying to get about your business, you've got to feed your family, particularly in these challenging times. The idea that you should have some protesters banging on about the fact that you should stop using petrol when you've got no other option is frankly insulting. But on top of that, it's actually counterproductive from their perspective, the protesters. You're supposed to be, if you want to try and push through a political point via protest, you generally want to try and bring people's sympathy to your side. We saw this, for example, with the suffragettes or whatever else. At the moment, as I think you guys have quite safely covered off, they're just annoying everyone. And last time I checked, people who annoy everyone very rarely win the argument in a democracy.
Do you think, Dan, there's something about the use of the word genocide here, which is an attempt to compensate for that deficit that you described, that sort of incapacity to we have got a clip, another clip. So they've used it in these tweets. We march in civil resistance against our genocidal government. And then pick a side. You're with our genocidal government, or you're on the side of life.
I'm originally from Devon, and there is a town in Devon called Totnes, which is hippie central. It's very lovely, but it is full of hippies. And every weekend on the Saturday when there is the market on, they have the handmade tales women, you know, in the red outfits, marching up and down the high street proclaiming the end of the world. The climate thing has become a pseudo religion. Now, we can argue over whether or not humanity's fossil fuel consumption, etc., is impacting the climate. We can have that debate. We can argue whether or not we think that impact is worth the trade-off versus what it's doing for human flourishing. But the idea that in the next 5 decades, climate change is going to wipe out humanity is frankly not backed up from the science, from what I understand. And this catastrophization that they're going through, I think, is more to do with their own limitations in their life. It is. It's a psychological pseudo breakdown these people are going through because they're obviously struggling to fill their life with something else. And if it wasn't climate, it would be named something else. And
should we see if we can? Should we see if we can get this clip running?
Sure.
Yeah, it doesn't want to play that one either. This is it's another GB News event, isn't it? Never mind. So there's been some discussion. Ed, you can jump in, but anytime you want. But I've muted you because there was feedback. Keir Starmer is accused of being in bed with Just Stop Oil, and that is exacerbated in its sort of effect by I don't know if I've got it in queued up here by the involvement of Dale Vince, who obviously is a funder of Just Stop Oil and the Labour Party.
Well, I mean, I'm sure next week, well, I believe it happened this week or last week, Keir Starmer U-turned on that as well anyway, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. But I think that the people need to understand that the Labour Party really has become a middle-class pressure group for people who, again, they want to change the world because they're really trying to fill some absence in their own life. And this is seen again and again and again with the way that they interact, not just over the environment, but look, I come from the left. My family were both Labour supporters. I support the SDP, which is a centre-left party. And the Labour Party has basically written the working class out of the story because those working class people may unfortunately just have different views to the professional managerial classes, which now make up the lion's share of the party. And Starmer has no choice but to try and do something to placate those people.
Yes, and
right,
I think
so this. Go on, Ed.
well, I think Dan is 100% right. And the thing is just to draw on his particular point about Keir Starmer's U-turn, and I've talked about this before, is that what he does is he takes these things and supports them as far as he can to demonstrate his difference with the Conservative Party to, if you like, his kind of grassroots, if you like, or his perceived grassroots. And then as soon as he feels he's in a strong enough position to abandon these positions, you know, whether it's the ULEZ, where he's for Black Lives Matter, or all the rest of it, any of these things, he will move as far towards them to placate them as much as he can. And then as he perceives that he's approaching power, he will dump them either before or after the general election. Now, I don't want to be too charitable towards him, because obviously if he gets into government and he dumps all of this mad green stuff and sacks Ed Miliband, that would be fantastic. My worry is that he will not move far enough, and that he'll always have this, he won't be politically strong enough to ever kind of dispose of some of this more madcap stuff, particularly when it comes to energy. And for example, the actual commitment he's made to Just Stop Oil to placate them, which is to open no new oil fields whatsoever. And his only kind of moderating position on that was to say, well, existing oil fields, you know, existing contracts obviously will honor those. But the idea that you wouldn't explore or have any new ones, or certainly that you would make a much more significant and comprehensive ban on shale gas exploration when there already is one in effect. So I don't want to be too complimentary and too hopeful that he will move to pragmatism if and when he becomes prime minister. That would be the hope, but it seems to me that I don't think he'll ever be powerful enough to actually have a sensible energy policy in government. But
with his own party, right? Well, Suella Braverman wrote a letter to him, asking him to sort of disassociate himself with the ambulance blockers and so on. And then briefly, because we've got the slide there, so I might as well mention it. Their funder, Dale Vince, launched an aviation revolution, and he had pretty much a run of adverts for this new airline on Talk TV this week. I was there briefly, with everyone sort of like going, well, okay, good for you, Dale, if you can make it work. The small print, the small green ink, as it were, is that for the first year, they're going to be run on kerosene, fossil fuels, and while they get the electric motors certified. So here's a guy with some money, can't be, you know, he's got some capital behind him, but really his whole business model has been subsidies, believing that he can do what Boeing, Airbus, Lockheed Martin, however many other manufacturers you want, with colossal legacies of R&D and so on and so forth, have been unable to do. And all these projects fail. So I think it's a little bit of a scam, and that 1 year is going to be turned into 2 years. Oh, but we're really trying to get these certified. We're going to 4 years. Oh no, we're really investing lots of money and trying to make, but we're still going to run our airline anyhow. Then Grant Shapps, who claims to be Secretary of State for Energy Security, has also written to Keir Starmer, trying to blame him as well for that. So there's a weird dynamic between the Tories and the Labour Party. That's what I'm getting at. that they sort of both want. Now, I don't know if it's going to play, but Grant Shapps is accusing Keir of is this not playing either? Ah, bloody hell. Anyway, what was going to be playing was a video of Michael Gove sitting down with the Extinction Rebellion in 2019, just before they the government announced, well, the Parliament held a citizens' assembly on climate change and also announced net zero. So it seems like the Tories are criticising Labour for doing what they were doing while you get the message. What's the dynamics, do you think, you two? What's going on here?
I mean, from a Conservative perspective, they have so pushed away their core vote, many of them who are, if not, anti-net zero, at the very least are skeptical of the time zone, the timeline that's been given for it, that they're now desperately trying to recover those voters by throwing a bit of red meat to them. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work. I speak regularly. As I said, I'm not a member of the Conservative Party. I speak to lots of people who were and are. And frankly, most of them appear to be willing on the death of the party now. They're so angry. So this performative pushback over green policies after watching the last 13 years of husky hugging, I think it was the slogan, yeah. I think is not going to work in any shape or form. And in actual fact, I think it may make the situation worse because people see how deeply cynical it is. And if the one thing that the politics really doesn't need at the moment is more cynicism. We live in a country and culture that literally is soaked in political cynicism because we've seen how our politicians are acting and how duplicitous they are, or two-faced. And I think that this could be wholly negative, actually, for the Conservatives. Certainly, everyone I speak to just seems like, yeah, but you were doing exactly the same. So it's no net positive for them. It's actually, ironically enough, a net zero for them. It's a real bad thing. Ed?
I think there's also just something to add on to that, which is generally the line, and it's why people are leaving the Tory party and getting so angry with them, is generally the line seems to be, look, we know we're really bad, but look, Keir Starmer's slightly worse, so come out and vote and support us, because however bad it is with us, it'll be slightly worse with Keir Starmer. And, never mind that that's the most uninspiring political message you could ever create. It's also, it works for a while, and then people just get fed up with it. They're just like, well, what's the point? And the tragedy is, of course, is that, you maybe saw a sign of it with that 20 billion for micronuclear power stations. The government still has this shot to say, we're going to get to net zero this way. We're going to build all these micronuclear power stations. We're going to go 80% nuclear. Meanwhile, we're going to rely on hydrocarbons as much as we need to while we transition, but we'll transition in time, and then we'll keep an eye on the technologies for wind and solar and whatever else could come through, and put a bit of money aside and keep them on track. And that's how we'll do it. But we'll always need the hydrocarbons to back up where we're trying to build up wind and power, because they are intermittent. And the battery technology isn't there. So there is a way forward, frankly, for a future Keir Starmer government or for the existing Conservative government. They were going to do this energy transition with nuclear, but use hydrocarbons while they get there. But they don't grasp it because the political dynamics are not about actually pragmatically dealing with this. The politics about it are this strange kind of pseudo cult, and everyone who's not in the cult being anxious about man-made climate change because it's what they've been fed, for decades.
But I think it's not just cult. It is now the acceptable opinion. And once it becomes the acceptable opinion, to not have that opinion is not just politically damaging, it's socially damaging. And I think there's a lot of people within politics, within the media and everything else that just aren't willing to deal with the social stigma that comes from just turning around and asking some hard questions. Go read a book. You know, I mean, I was reading is it Vaclav Smil? Apologies, I don't know the exact pronunciation. And he was talking about in there, and he talks about the various materials or whatever that are required for the human civilization. One of the things he talks about is artificial fertilizer. But guess where that comes from? Natural gas. Guess how much of the world population is fed by artificial fertilizer? About 50%. So the idea that you can just turn gas off tomorrow to make the climate people happy is frankly not backed up by any reasonable person who actually understands how the world works. But the people in charge, the professional classes, the liberal classes, aren't actually engaged enough at that level. All they know is this is a socially acceptable or non-socially acceptable opinion to hold, and that's it's like train tracks. They just run on it. I mean, one of the things that I've been regularly accused of my time in Twitter is like, well, you know, you voted leave, ergo, I bet you I can tell you every opinion you have. They don't, but that's fair enough. But I would actually argue the counterpoint to that, which is if you are of a certain status within society, not all of them, there are a few, but for the vast majority, I'll bet you any money that I could roughly tell you what you will socially say in public, because you know the implications of it. Social stigma is a dreadfully powerful thing. And if you're at the very top of society, you've got the most to lose. And these people are. They may not be the richest. They may not be the most powerful in terms of earning billions or anything else. But these are the people in our institutions who run things and have that direct power, but also indirect power, the ability to actually influence things, both at an individual level and also at a mass.
Yes, and there's a prime example of that is that I think it was the first PMQs Rishi Sunak did. The then leader of the Greens asked him, because it was a pledge of his and Liz Truss's to allow investigations into shale gas if local communities supported it. He didn't have to commit to that because he lost, so none of his commitments in his actual campaign applied. And the leader of the Greens, Caroline, what's her name, said to him,
Lucas,
you know, is he going to move on that? And he almost like it was if he kind of thought about it on the spot and said, no, I'm not going to go ahead with that. And it just felt like that was the social pressure. That was the received acceptable view to have, was actually, no, shale gas is too toxic with my mates that I have drinks with. So, you know, we're just not going to go with that. And we're going to stick to this ludicrous policy, which is that you can't explore shale gas if it creates a tremor, the equivalent of a truck going past your house, which obviously makes it impossible.
We need to move on. So speaking of socially reinforcing the points, these are temperatures from two places in the UK. Today, 21 degrees in Oxford and 19 degrees in Manchester. This is in July. These are small temperatures. So, so what I'm going to go on to talk about is Project Gaslight, I'm calling it. And that's all of the broadcasters just trying to tell people who, I mean, it's been as low as 13 degrees centigrade in the northwest of England. Yet every broadcaster, I'm not going to play it because we haven't been having much luck with media. No, it's not going to play. But all of the broadcasters have, and all of the news media, and even GB News, would you believe it, has been trying to sort of talk about heat waves. And a lot of it comes back to what we knew around COP26, was this is the use of behavioral science techniques. I have to say, I think that they're crap. I think most people can smell them and can see this stuff coming. And when they see their broadcaster going blah blah blah, heat wave in Greece, 45 degrees centigrade, when they're actually thinking about turning the central heating on, if they haven't already, I just don't think they work. But that seems to be what's going on, isn't it? They take us for fools.
Yeah, and this is happening globally. My wife is French. We have French satellite TV into the house, so she watches it most nights. And even I said to her, because my French is terrible, I was like, there's some words that tend to trigger me in the sense that I pick up on them. And you glance up, and every news channel, every weather forecast, there is always a section about global warming. Always. And, you know, when you look at the numbers and you track back through history, the numbers being seen in France are not exceptional. My wife is from near Lyon, you know, regularly will go up to 35, 40 degrees. There's no problem at all. And yet you would think that it's the end of the world. This has never happened before. Another friend, I work for an American company who lives in Charleston, South Carolina, which is about as hot and sweaty as you can get. He now gets text messages telling him when it's hot as an emergency. And he's a little bit like, there is a reason why I moved to Charleston, South Carolina from Maryland, because it is hot and sweaty and I don't want to be cold anymore. So this is really very much something that's happening globally. And I do think that people are starting to see through it. It's very hard not to. Even my mother, who, no problem at all, you know, does totally believe the global warming thing. Even she said, you know, it's starting to become a bit obvious. It's push, 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 push. There is a tipping point where it goes over the edge from being vaguely a little bit subtle to just being an out and out attempt at indoctrination.
Yeah. So I see the Daily Skeptic are reporting that now the government has in this effort has even extended to funding the editing of climate science Wikipedia, which is kind of mad. There's a big story at the end that we want to talk about, so I'm just going to go over a few of the other stories that come back over this week. One was George Monbiot, who's pretty much against farming now, and he thinks there's this enormous disaster of what I think they call multiple breadbasket failures. It's a hypothesis that you could get some effect cascading through the world and everywhere that produces grains, especially and food will fail and will all starve and die. And this is almost inevitable for him. And his solution is to eat a pancake made out of bacteria grown in a lab. He's deadly serious, but he's being taken seriously. That's the weird thing. And none of these politicians, let alone his colleagues in the media, are pointing out to him, we have very good harvests year after year after year, and food security increases year after year after year.
Surely, if you're predicting catastrophic famines, you'd want to farm more to give you more backup in the event that, say, I don't know, the American Midwest, the harvest failed there. You'd be like, okay, well, we're heavily farming over here. This is the insanity of what's going on. Logically, it's a little bit like a cobweb. As soon as you touch it, it just falls to pieces. We're just using basic logical analysis.
Yes. I think. Well, we're going to run to the final thing. So we've only got 5 or so minutes left. But I mean, it's just this guy has been at it for 10, 20, 30 years and it's just ceaseless story after story, and they crumble and then they reform and then they crumble and they reform. In that time, the world has improved dramatically, notwithstanding sort of contemporary problems. But he can't see it. He just gets more and more and more miserable as he gets older and older and older. Anyway, this is all leading apparently to something of a backlash worries The Guardian, as citizens and businesses start feeling the costs of the energy transition. And then the author, who looks pretty miserable too, worries about Dutch farmers being up in arms over stringent limits, the German public fretting over gas boilers, and so on. And it's like, well, they've started to understand that people might have their own ideas about how society should be run. And those are ideas where you keep your car, you keep your boiler, you don't have the government tell you you've got to close down your farm and take ownership of it. And all of these fancy pants ideas about how the world has got to be reorganized and society and the economy have got to be reorganized can shove off. So are they getting it? We'll have to see. Anyhow, a bunch of people who aren't getting it, who haven't got it, is Coutts Bank, who say loudly, be proud, be bold, be you, unless you happen to be Nigel Farage, which of course is because they've taken his bank account away. But I don't think you have to be, as Ben Habib was pointing out, you don't have to be Nigel Farage to be on the receiving end of this abuse of financial power. And you don't even have to like him to think it's bad. But what's been really frightening for me is, not for me personally, but it's been horrible to see it. People just doubling down on, Nigel Farage had his bank taken away. No biggie. But I mean, although many across the political spectrum are recognising that as a problem, there's a lot of bad faith around, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, and I am of the left long since stacked its principles at the door and just carried on. You know, the idea that you should take a principled stand for everyone over certain issues seems to become less and less common. It's on the right as well, but certainly it is endemic across the left now. You know, and this feeds very much into the freedom of speech question. You know, I've had this discussion actually today on Twitter with a couple of people. You know, it's like, he didn't get debanked, which was what I initially thought he had been. But yeah, okay, but he was offered, he couldn't get a product that normally he would have been allowed to have. How about you're famous, you're rich, you walk into a Ferrari showroom, you go, I'll have a Ferrari, please. They go, here, you can have this secondhand Fiat 500. Yeah, you'd be angry, particularly if all you did was express a political opinion. And this is the danger now, is that, and you've seen it historically anyway, recently over the trans thing, which is the reaction, for example, on social media. You would get blocked if you expressed any skepticism towards the trans thing. Climate change is another one. And it's only since, certainly on Twitter, since Elon Musk purchased the platform, that these blockings, mutings, whatever we want to call them, have gone away. But it curtails freedom of speech. It curtails your right to an expression opinion. Whether I agree with them or not is irrelevant. It doesn't make a difference. I don't personally like Keir Starmer, but I'd be first out of the gates to turn around and defend him if he was being debanked. I'd be the first out of the gates to defend pretty much anyone if they're being debanked or told they couldn't express an opinion without fear. And I think this is something that's now been lost in the translation. It seems to have been lost in the cultural malaise, which has become this ultra competitive, you've got to lose completely so I can win completely, without any idea of the fact that at some stage the shoe will be on the other foot and you're going to be the one getting kicked by those rules or by those regulations.
I think it's a really important point about the shoe being on the other foot, is because these people don't think the shoe will ever be on the other foot.
True.
And the big worry is about this debanking is, of course, it's not just Nigel Farage, just a bunch of smaller people who've reported to him and others and been banging on about this. When he first raised this, people were getting critical of him, saying, oh, you're only talking about it because it affected you. But the thing is that this is the real concern. And it's that it is a wider extension of the environmental social model for finance and for it to affect your private decisions. So it is a concern that you'll get a Chinese-style social credit system, and you'll get it in the Western banking system with and using climate as the main lever of that. And this is not.
Coots have been especially interested in ESG. So the ESG model, the specification that they have implemented, isn't just your bog standard. ESG comes in a nice box. They've gone through for the super duper benchmark of ESG which is produced by an outfit called the B Corporation, which I think the B stands for benefit, and this is a sort of extra stringent form of virtue signaling, I guess. We have got another bloody video which we can't show. We can. Can you hear it? Can you hear it?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh well.
Well,
we test ran it
Andrew Neil.
It did work before.
Andrew Neil was reporting there'd been a Facebook group that had just launched for NatWest clients who had been debanked, and they were sharing information about how to go through this special process to find out exactly what had gone on and why. And he was saying that 10,000 people had already joined this group, and I suspect this is now going to go across the entire banking system.
It's exploded, hasn't it? It's really I mean, it's absolutely like, and I don't think it's like within a couple of days, it's been turned from a Nigel Farage to BBC journalists, some of them not, apologizing, begging for forgiveness. Andrew Neil obviously going, and other journalists going full on with this. It's kind of relentless, isn't it? It's kind of shocked me, the speed at which and the force with which this is being challenged.
I think it feeds back to. I think more and more people do see through the propaganda. They see through the activism that now intrudes upon their life, and they're become more and more aggressive on this or any other thing about pushing back. You know, you can look at the reaction to the Bud Light. Was it Bud Light? I think it was in America. That brand's done, finished, done. I doubt that it will ever recover from what they've just gone through. And you know what you're now starting to see is very much companies and organizations are being punished by the public when they step over those lines. You're there to provide a service. I don't want your political opinion. If you're going to give me your political opinion or try and foist a political opinion on me, I'm going to fight you or I'm just going to dump you. And I think that reaction now is gathering steam within the system. Another one that I would point to, if you want to see an interesting one for that, is actually the Walt Disney Corporation, which is going woke or has gone woke, and very much it is going broke if you actually look at the reaction to the films and series it's producing. So people are reacting to it. They're fed up with the propaganda. They're fed up with being moralized at, and they're not going to put up with it. So these corporations can expect this reaction again and again and again. I do think that the banking thing is a particularly special one because it was kept hidden from the public. Now, perhaps if Nigel Farage hadn't been the person impacted, then it wouldn't have come out in that way. But I suspect it would have done in due course, and you would have seen something similar.
ESG is like, is it like Bud Light? I see what you mean, Dan, about the it being a different thing in compared to the products that Disney or Bud Light have offered. But I mean, Coots customers, are they gonna start pulling their money? Are they gonna? I mean, can they kill the brand in the same way? I mean, is that a bit far fetched, or is it just the political embarrassment? I mean, so other people have made the point it was the reputational management team that sort of decided to pull Nigel Farage's account, and then have done themselves immense reputational damage in the process. Who is going to respond to this? Is this going to be more of the news media driving a political change, excuse me, or is this going to be customers interrogating the banks for themselves and saying, I don't want this? And where do they go?
I think that the reputational damage to the banks, and this I expect it to roll for many weeks now. They'll expect it to die down, and then there'll be another group from another bank. The reputational damage to the entire sector will be so bad that I suspect there will be a general clipping of the wings internally. On top of that, I think that by the time this will be one of the few times where a moral panic will actually work in our favor, if you like. You will now see, or I suspect you'll see, is a political moral panic start gathering steam, which may well feed into new regulation or something similar to that. But I think that what you're beginning to see with the banking, with various other corporations, is that realization that ESG, whatever, it doesn't make a difference. Dabbling in politics alongside what you do to earn money as a company, it's not going to end well. It will not end well. And I suspect that is probably going to be a very big takeaway that comes from a lot of these interactions. It was interesting a few months ago, Ben & Jerry's, the famous ice cream maker, which always dabbles in politics, got slapped down by, I believe they're owned by Unilever, that well-known FMCG brand. And I think that is a good example, again, of the public reaction to corporations that dabble in the politics is now becoming intolerable for their bottom line. And that's feeding back into a kind of a reverse cycle into the shareholders who are turning around and going, your job's to sell ice cream, your job's to
do you think so? Because that one of the ESG's sort of primary driver was shareholder activism, and it was shareholder activism pushing banks into policy decisions with respect to their clients who might have fossil fuel interests or so on. To say, there's been a divestment sort of drive at Barclays and others. And of course, the famously in the last few weeks and last few months has been a trend of companies pulling out of net zero agreements and ESG services. But the B Corp and other sort of organizations like them were sort of set up by the eco billionaires, if you like, as shareholder models of shareholder activism, and then we can change the world by changing capitalism. But that's not the sort of message that most people get, is it? They're not sort of invited into a discussion about capitalism versus alternatives to it. It's we're going to change capitalism, and you're going to have an EV if you can afford one. It's kind of alienating for most people.
I don't think most people are pretty oblivious to the financial markets and corporations, which I can understand. They are very aware of where those corporations intersect with them, which is why when you get very visible, obvious things like this, banking, whatever else, you get a public outcry. From an ESG perspective, I suspect from the people I speak to within the financial system, and it's not that I'm deeply embedded, I know various people I speak to, they seem to think that the ESG thing, there will probably be the equivalent of Senate hearings and everything else because it's such a fraud. And I think that wouldn't surprise me at all. You see a great deal of greenwashing at the best of times, and I suspect they're using gallons of it to greenwash a lot of things. But also on top of that, and this is kind of speaking from a more personal perspective, whether they like it or not, you're going to need fossil fuels. And at some stage, that reality is going to intersect with the pressure not to invest in fossil fuels. And if the financial sector is not willing to invest in them, then governments will have to step in to do it. It will. We can't live without them, like I said, in terms of even just natural gas. And what's likely to happen is profit is both the positive and negative in terms of the outcomes. But when you look at, say, the FTSE 100, Shell, BP, and everything else, these are hugely profitable companies that are actually massively undervalued at the moment because of ESG. No one wants to touch them. If you take bottom of the market for BP, I know because I'm, I've bought shares in them, they were at 60 pence in the middle of the COVID thing. I think last time I checked, they were about £2.40. And they're still undervalued if you actually look at them. These are massively profitable companies that have huge amount of cash flow turnover. And at some stage, that reality and people's need to invest to find profitable companies and to find way, particularly pension funds and everything else, will drag people back to them. There will be winners from this situation. And it, like all these things, once the herd moves, it tends to move en masse. Humans, unfortunately, are very herd-like.
Right. Well, there's lots to take in there, and I hope you're right. And it sounds like we might be on the cusp of a tipping point that maybe things move in the right direction. Maybe that's too optimistic. But look, we've gone over nearly quarter of an hour after more than we said we would. But I hope we can speak in more depth on this in the future, and we can have you back. But stay on the line for a moment, and we'll have a chat afterwards. And I'll say goodbye to our guests, our viewers even. Thanks very much for joining us once again. We'll be back next week. Maybe even we won't have gremlins next week, and something will work. We will have lights that work and videos that work, and maybe even question and answer system that works. If you want to help us buy things like gaffer tape so that they stop so they don't break and so they carry on working and we can patch them up, then please do consider supporting us by going to our website and clicking on donate. Otherwise, please do share our work. We're not just a website and a live stream. We're working with lots of other organizations, we're working with journalists, we're helping other people understand the climate debate and all of its issues. So yeah, have a great week and see you then. And be careful of all of the extreme weather. Bye.